Is the Trey Hendrickson trade scenario back on the table for the Detroit Lions? After the surprising retiring of Detroit Lions legend Frank Ragnow, the team will be receiving back a large sum of money that will no longer be needing to pay to the remainder of Ragnow's contract. Is that money enough to entice a player like Trey Hendrickson to turn over to Detroit, or is it still not going to be enough for the Lions to pull the trigger on a potential all-pro duo in Aiden Hutchinson and another pass rusher? That has been the question that everybody seems to be asking over the last couple of days. And I think it's a really interesting question because money is really the big contributor here. Money is the deciding factor on whether the Lions can afford to get this deal done and pay the rest of their cast, or whether it would simply be too much and not allow them to really keep together the core that they've spent nearly half a decade building. Well, let's take a look at the Lions pass rush first, because overall, I think it's a little bit underrated, if not relying on some exterior factors. Aiden Hutchinson is, of course, the Lions' #1 edge rusher. He is an all-pro. He is a defensive player of the year type of caliber. He is one of, if not the best defensive ends in all of the National Football League. Marcus Davenport is incredibly underrated. He's a player that, when healthy, is probably easily a top 40 defensive end in football. 6'7", 270 pounds. He is a huge edge rusher. He is a great NFL defensive end, and when he's on the field, he plays really well. He was great against the Los Angeles Rams. He was fantastic against the Arizona Cardinals, but the problem is, of course, that's the only 2 games that he played a season ago. Health has been a major concern for Davenport over a majority of his career. He's never played an entire 16-game season. And even back to the healthier portions of his career, the first 4 to 5 seasons, he was still only averaging 11 to 12 games a season and not quite being able to get through the entirety of the NFL gauntlet. So while they're very talented at that position with Marcus Davenport, the reliability certainly isn't where they want it to be. Al-Qadim Muhammad was a great find a season ago, had 3 sacks in 8 games, was a good contributor as a pass rusher, but really isn't the traditional defensive end that the Lions really like. Josh Paschal is a great run defender and is more of the traditional defensive end, but doesn't really have the pass rushing upside that most people look for. Ahmad Hassanin has great statistics coming from a pretty good sized school, coming from, a good opportunity to be a Detroit Lions edge rusher. But of course, he was a 6th round pick. He didn't come from a huge Power 5 program, didn't play huge Power 5 competition every year. So while his numbers were certainly good, that is a big concern for some fans as well. And then you go to the depth, right? You go to, Mitchell Agude, you go to Isaac Ukwu, you go to Nate Lynn, players that were undrafted for a reason, players that looked good in the preseason, but haven't really shown the ability to do anything that good at an NFL level as of today. You take a look at their statistics from a season ago. While they did rank 24th in team sacks, they ranked 4th in pressures across the NFL, 4th in quarterback hits, while being 3rd in blitz percentage and being 7th in scoring defense across the league. They were far from a bad defense a season ago, and I think a lot of people get caught up in the last 5 to 6 games of the season, right, where injuries really started to pile up, where teams really started to put up points, and certainly that is a concern. From Green Bay in week 14 through the rest of the NFL season, including the divisional round game, the Detroit Lions allowed on average close to 30 points per game, with a singular outlier in week 18 versus Minnesota. They allowed 31 points on Thursday Night Football to Green Bay. They allowed 45 points to the Buffalo Bills. They allowed 31 to the San Francisco 49ers. They allowed 45 to the Washington Commanders in the playoff game. And even going into teams like Chicago, who didn't have a great offense, they still had good offensive performances versus a truly beat up Detroit Lions defense. That being said, however, the first half of 2024 was simply phenomenal. Through the first 13 weeks of the NFL season, the Detroit Lions only had 3 games in which their defense allowed more than 21 points. They had 6 games, so less than half, that their defense allowed more than 300 total yards, and in 11 of those 13 games, the Detroit Lions had at least 1 takeaway, with many of those games being multiple takeaways. They were a phenomenal defense. They allowed 6 points to the Colts, they allowed 6 points to the Jaguars, they allowed just 14 points to the Tennessee Titans. They allowed just 9 points to the Dallas Cowboys. They were really, really good throughout the early parts of the season. They were getting takeaways, they were getting to the quarterback, they weren't allowing points on the scoreboard, and they were being a big contributing factor as to why the Detroit Lions won as many games as they did. In fact, the only game that they lost in that stretch was to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in a 16-20 loss, a game in which the Lions only allowed 20 points on the day, only allowed 2 touchdowns through the entirety of the 4 quarters, and the offense couldn't get it done. The offense was the reason that the Detroit Lions lost that week 2 matchup, with the turnovers and the inability to score in the red zone, the defense was the reason the Lions were even in that game to begin with. So the idea that the Lions defense was bad a season ago towards the end was kind of true, but obviously those statistics are a little bit misconstrued with all of the injuries that they faced. Now, the idea of adding Trey Hendrickson or adding an elite edge rusher to this group is far from new. Right? It has been a common talking point since the trade deadline of 2 seasons ago. Back in 2023, the Lions had to go trade for Chase Young. They had to trade for Montez Sweat. They had to trade for Leonard Williams. They had to trade for Myles Garrett or Max Crosby or whoever the big name at the time may have been. And it's never really been the most realistic of scenarios, right? Those players are expensive. Those players need new contracts. Those players are not going to be a guaranteed success with the Detroit Lions. So to gamble your future on a player that isn't a guarantee is certainly a major risk for the Lions. But Trey Hendrickson has been the common reoccurring name. With 17.5 sacks in both 2023 and 2024, Trey Hendrickson has been one of the best pass rushers in the league for over, I would say, the last 5 to 6 years, but certainly in the last 2, he's taken his game to another level. With 19 tackles for loss a season ago, 2 forced fumbles, and a first-team All-Pro nod. He's had double-digit sacks for 4 of the last 5 seasons and has been a Pro Bowler for the last 5 seasons consecutively. Now, the most recent trade offer that has been proposed is that the Detroit Lions would send a 2nd and a 4th-round pick to the Cincinnati Bengals in retrieving Trey Hendrickson and a 5th-round pick. That value in and of itself doesn't necessarily sound poor, but when you also consider that the extension with Trey Hendrickson coming would cost the Lions nearly $30 million a year, the deal looks significantly less tempting than maybe it would have been otherwise. Trey Hendrickson at the moment makes roughly $15 to $16 million a year, and that contract is certainly workable. That is a good edge rusher contract to have, especially for a player of Trey Hendrickson's caliber, but 30 plus, especially for a player that is going to be 31 come the next NFL season, that is a big concern. That's a big gamble for a player that could be reaching the end of his physical prime and could be locked up with the Lions for 3, maybe even 4 years if a new contract extension is warranted. The Lions do have cap space. They had $40 million cap space before the Frank Ragnow retirement, and depending how they want to kind of spread out the remaining contract and the remaining guaranteed stuff to Frank Ragnow, they're going to free up between $5.5 to $10 million over the next 2 seasons. That has yet to be disclosed as to how they're paying him, if they're going to pay him mostly this season, if they're going to split it up over the next 2 years. But the reality is they can free up between $5 to $10 million this year, giving them between 45 and 50 total in their cap space. That is plenty of room to add a player like Trey Hendrickson. And that is, even with leaving a lot of room for the rookies, leaving a lot of room for an emergency cap fund, and leaving potentially up to $20 million to roll over into 2026. The problem is that 2026 is going to get expensive. That is when Jared Goff's contract kicks in. That is when Amon-Ra St. Brown contracts kick in. That is when Penei Sewell's contract is going to take effect. That is when a lot of the big numbers are going to start to fly at Detroit, and they're already down to under $20 million in cap space for next season. They don't have a ton of money to play with, so adding another $30 million contract to that fold puts them over the cap space before they've even re-signed their players, before they've re-signed their role players, before they re-sign their stars, before they extend players like Aiden Hutchinson, Jameson Williams, Brian Branch, Jack Campbell, Jahmyr Gibbs, Alex Anzalone, and Sam Laporta. They're already out of money if they make this Trey Hendrickson move. And that's a move that even with adding an all-pro player, they're out of money, right? Before adding it, they're down to just $20 million. And each and every one of those players could potentially cost up to $20 million a season each. The Lions are down to the finite financial points of their offseason. They don't have a ton of money to throw around, even with the added $5 to $10 million under the Frank Ragnow retirement. Now, with that being said, I truly do believe that this move is still too expensive for Detroit. They cannot afford an edge rusher to be paid $30 million at 30 years old, but probably getting a 2 to 3 year extension at the minimum with all the contracts that they have. He's a player that's never been with the Detroit Lions before. He's a player that's never fit within the Detroit Lions scheme. He's not a particularly great edge setter or run defender, which is something the Lions prioritize really, really heavily. So why would the Detroit Lions do this? Why would they go out and get an edge rusher that is too expensive, that doesn't fit their scheme, that's never been here before, and just doesn't fit with what the Detroit Lions are looking for right now. Not to mention a player that would sacrifice 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 players on the defensive side of the ball that have built things up and kept the Detroit Lions competitive on that side of the ball over the last couple of seasons. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. But what does make a bit of sense, and what could potentially happen in a more realistic scenario, is that this opens the door actually for Zadarius Smith to come back. Now, I have made it very clear that I do not believe the Lions need Zadarius Smith to come back. I don't think he is significantly better than a player like Marcus Davenport. I don't think he's particularly a better player than Al-Qaeda Muhammad at this point. At least he wasn't a season ago, not significantly anyway. And to spend $11 to $12 million on him for the Detroit Lions just wasn't worth it. That's why they cut him at the beginning of the offseason and have yet to re-sign him. He's looking to make $10, $11, $12 million a season by the sounds of it. And the Lions just haven't been willing to pay that money. They don't have that much money to give out over the next 2 seasons. But now with, again, 5 to 10 million, depending on how they do this, they could potentially free up that much money to bring in Zadarius Smith, essentially making his contract a free amenity from the Frank Ragnow retirement. Zadarius Smith has been with the football team. He has played with the Detroit Lions. He's seen success with the Detroit Lions. 4 sacks in 8 games a season ago is nothing to scoff at. And even if the Lions don't truly believe that Zadarius Smith is a, true option, a true number 2 anymore in the NFL, or even if they feel like the value isn't necessarily worth it, with the retirement of Frank Ragnow, that contract essentially becomes free. Even if you pay him that $10 million, even if you pay him that $11 million, that contract is essentially covered by the retirement savings of Frank Ragnow. And that, I think, is a far more interesting and likely scenario than bringing in a player like Trey Hendrickson that would be 3 times the cost and break the Detroit Lions financially in the future. So with that being said, no, I don't think Trey Hendrickson's trade option is back on the table. And truthfully, I'm not sure if it was ever on the table to begin with. But with the retiring of Frank Ragnow, it is going to open up a little bit of money. Some money to bring in a player maybe like Zadarius Smith, maybe like Jadeveon Clowney, a player that the Lions don't necessarily need, but could certainly use, could certainly add to the depth of the defense, an area that they really struggled at a season ago. So while I don't think it's necessarily needed, and I don't think it's particularly likely, I think it's far more likely that they sign a player like Zadarius Smith from free agency than it is to trade for a player like Trey Hendrickson. So with that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Let me know down in the comments below what you think about the Detroit Lions situation. Should they trade for Hendrickson? Should they sign Zadarius Smith? Should they just stay pat and let some of that money roll over into the next season? I'd love to hear your guys' opinions, but with all that being said, thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions!